I want to bring in former FBI Assistant Director Ron Hosko to talk about all this. He's joining us now. Ron, thanks so much. Here's the thing, Ron, that I am curious about right now, because the gunman, the shooter, Nikolas Cruz, is alive and he is in police custody. What are investigators going to be focusing on? You know, for a lot of people, the facts are that he gunned down 17 individuals in the school behind me here. But what are investigators hoping to learn from talking to him?
Well, they're going to do a deep dive into his history to the extent he's willing to share it. You know, and take a look at his mental health, his engagement with the school or disengagement with the school, with others. So often these cases do involve someone who is, you know, feels like they're an outsider. They tend to be a loner, may telegraph their intentions, maybe not. And so the opportunity that presents itself with a defendant now who is alive, who can be interrogated, who can be interviewed, and may be willing to share his story, may fill in a lot of the details for law enforcement they certainly want to hear. And that includes the weapon acquisition. That includes information, bits and pieces of his life that he shared with others. You know, those warning signs that may have given others an opportunity to raise the flag and perhaps were missed, certainly with the weapon acquisition. You know, mental health treatment in the past, how he perhaps became disconnected from his classmates and from his school, and ultimately what built up this desire to go back there and take so many lives. And then on how, you know, the whole planning cycle. What was his plan always to escape? Was it to blend in with other students? How did he accomplish that? We know that we believe that he did some things to create some confusion, pulled the fire alarm, allegedly wear gas masks. So this is an opportunity for law enforcement to try to deconstruct all of that through his mind and then match it up with physical evidence at the scene, whether that's video, you know, the targeting, whether specific people were targeted, or was this, I'm going to go exact my revenge on the school. All of that can be deconstructed with him and then reconstructed at the scene.
Ron, we always talk about soft targets and how difficult it is to prevent these types of attacks. Are you surprised that this young man was able to acquire so many weapons?
Well, you know, I think that is a very worthy discussion, and I know there's some talk about this is not the time. I do believe this is the time. You know, how profound were his mental health issues? Were they documented? Did they go to a doctor, a mental health professional? And then what happened? These are worthy questions because we see it happening time and again. Very often there's more than one component to these active shooter incidents, and the components are quite clearly a weapon or weapons, and then mental health. There are so many gaps in the system, Vlad, that I think it is long overdue that Congress and state legislatures start to plug the obvious gaps, and that is the collection of mental health information as an excluder, as something that an automated background check, which is what the FBI conducts. They're bouncing your information as a potential gun purchaser off of databases in an automated way. They're not, you know, typically picking up the phone and calling a bunch of locations. They're trying to do this in an automated way. It happens very quickly. But if those excluders, if those disqualifiers are not of record somewhere, like we saw in the Texas church shooting not long ago, where the military, and this is still the case, had not put in thousands of records of people who should be excluded but haven't been. Those are huge gaps that are existing today that could be filled. That's before we start talking about preventing people from buying AR-15s at all or weapon magazine limitations. There are big gaps in the system today that Congress ought to be acting on tomorrow.
And that's the question that I think a lot of people have, and we will have in the days and weeks ahead, Ron, is you make a great point that perhaps Some members of Congress, as they have in the past, have said, you know, look, this isn't the discussion that we should be having, whether or not people should be able to buy these types of weapons. But there are other things that can be done. And yet, here we are on another morning after another shooting, this time in a school, and the discussion you and I are having, it doesn't seem to be the discussions that our lawmakers are having, because you just identified for us some significant gaps that could be closed.
Yeah, these systems, whether it's state and federal background checks within a state, and particularly as it relates to known disqualifiers and particularly mental health. I know there is a challenge there. We're trying to protect privacy rights of the people being treated. And then what do you do about somebody who is, you know, kind of slipping towards the edge? They seek mental health care and they already own weapons. You know, so what do you do about that? What do you do about somebody who doesn't have weapons? At a minimum, we ought to have legislation that clearly precludes that people are commanded to collect and report in a regular way that is protected from outside intrusion, that law enforcement can bounce their inquiries off of and say, no, this person can't have a gun. And so often we see those people acquiring weapons. We know there's a hole on the street. A person-to-person sale is only going to be tracked later. And so that's another gap that should be at least considered. But these big, obvious ones ought to be fixed. They beg being fixed, and yet we can't get Congress to raise the subject.
Ron, the other thing that I'm struck by, and it's something that I was talking to Jim Gard, the teacher, I don't know if you heard that interview that we did with Jim Gard, one of the teachers who kept his students and his classroom calm during the attack, is just, it sounds to me, and again, this is just less than 24 hours after the attack has happened, but it sounds to me as if the school did everything right. They train for this. They prepare for this. The students know. I can't imagine being a kid in an American school today in 2018, in middle school and in junior high school, and training for a scenario as heinous as this one, and yet that's what schools are doing. So schools, where did that guidance come from? Is it in the wake of Columbine? Schools and municipalities on their own decided to implement some of these training procedures, or is it something that has been done at the federal level? And if it's not done at the federal level, Ron, should it be?
I think really, Vlad, apart from Columbine, where law enforcement took a lot of lessons. You know, back then, it was try to make contact with the shooters and negotiate with them. And law enforcement writ large realized that was a failed strategy. And so law enforcement started to change dramatically after Newtown, where the sense was, certainly after Columbine, but the sense was we have to get response teams into these facilities as quickly as possible. But at the same time, we need to train. Law enforcement needs to train. And I think collectively, pushed very much by the federal government. You know, when I was in the FBI, we were pushing legislation and we were pushing training aggressively toward police, and trained thousands of first responders across the country in active shooter response. So I think we collectively, America collectively, was waking up after Newtown, which was a brutal and horrific wake-up call, and realizing we really need to supercharge this. And I do give credit to the Obama White House for playing a role. Health and Human Services played a role. FBI, DHS came together. We did get some legislation that was an enabler for the feds, but then we really pushed this training down to the schools and across the law enforcement community. And now you have to be really in the Stone Ages if you're a school administrator and you haven't had active shooter drills, because we see from yesterday and before, that's a terrible mistake. And you see the success, despite this carnage, schools that train are preparing to succeed, not to fail. And same applies to law enforcement here. From my perspective, sitting 1,000 miles away, the Broward County and law enforcement response, both police, other first responders, looked pretty darn practiced. And that's a credit to them, because I think they do practice, and we need that in America today.
Absolutely. The other thing that struck me, Ron, is some of the tactics, if you will, that Nikolas Cruz used. We understand that he perhaps may have pulled a fire alarm, as you heard the teacher there saying that he thought it was strange that there was another fire alarm because they had already had a drill. And you and I have had the discussion when it comes to foreign terrorism, things that happen abroad, how the terrorists are always changing their tactics. They're adapting. They are learning our response, what we do as a society, what we do as a military, what we do as law enforcement, and they adapt to that. Are you at all surprised? This seems to me, at least, to be the first time in a scenario like this. And again, this is a he's in his he's 18, but he's still a kid. That he perhaps went through some of the training that you and I have just been talking about that kids have to go through in America, and sort of knew what kids and what teachers will do in certain scenarios, and he used that to his advantage. Were you surprised by that?
That's just a very real risk that we have, whether you're in a business environment and you have these drills in a business environment, in an industrial setting, in a school setting, in a church setting. It could well be that one of the participants in the drills is later the offender. And so they have seen from the inside what the response looks like. We also have some offenders, and we just saw this play out in Las Vegas too, where Stephen Paddock was searching the internet for SWAT tactics. He was looking for what is the look and feel of that response. Some of that's timing, some of that's tactics, but he was planning for the arrival of the SWAT team. We know there were video cameras outside of his room to watch that and to respond to it. Some of these offenders are going to know what the response looks like. And frankly, the response isn't going to change that much. Law enforcement's going to do what they've been training to do all along. They have to do it in a dynamic, fearsome way in an active shooter scenario. And some of these offenders are preparing for that and thinking through it. And this is not spur of the moment. They put some thought to it. A lot of them put some thought to suicide by cop or suicide as the final act. And it's just a reality that law enforcement and the schools are going to have to face, that there are offenders that are looking to create additional confusion. There's a lot of confusion to begin with, as all these different law enforcement agencies are coming together, trying to get their communications right, trying to figure out who's been deployed to what floor and to what section of a building. There's plenty of confusion to begin with, and these guys, sadly, know to add to it.
Indeed. Very sad indeed. Ron Hosko, former Assistant FBI Director, thank you as always. We're going to keep talking to you throughout the morning and throughout the day.